This is our fourth video reviewing material from Unit number 4, the Neoclassical Age. And here we have the major work that our editors chose for our book, and that is a selection from Jonathan Swift's novels, Gulliver's Travels. Now, Gulliver was a ship's surgeon who got shipwrecked. And when he awoke from his shipwreck, he was on the shore, and he was tied down by cables. As he looked around, he noticed all these tiny people around him. And you can see that from our picture from the beginning of Gulliver's Travels. There you see Gulliver bowing down to one of the little people that he met, and those are the people of Lilliput. So our editors picked part of the Lilliputian section to talk about. Now, Gulliver also travels, after he gets away from the people of Lilliput, to the land of Brobdingnag. Some of our DLPs have mentioned Brobdingnag. And so there the situation is reversed. Gulliver is the same size, of course, but then the people of Brobdingnag are giants in the same proportion Gulliver was to the Lilliputians. Then he travels to a land that's a floating island, the land of Laputa, where scientists are trying to get sunbeams of cucumbers. And then he goes to another land, the land of the Houyhnhnms, which are horse people. The humans are brutes and the horses are the intelligent ones. Swift, of course, is writing a story that has been considered a very fun children's novel for hundreds of years, but it's actually a satire, primarily ridiculing English politics as well as religion in England, both for the Catholic Church and the Anglican Church, of which he was a part. Jonathan Swift was a minister, and so he looked upon his writings as sermons for people to learn about, to try to encourage them to modify their behavior. Well, he realized very quickly that satire doesn't do that very well. Satire is a type of writing that points out, mostly in a humorous way, the problems of society in the hopes that society will reform. But he said when he wrote the second edition introduction, he said, "I cannot tell that my novel has accomplished one thing that I had intended. Satire is a mirror in which people behold everybody else's faces, but never their own." And so, as a historical document, though, it's very interesting. We can look back at a satire and see what the problems of that particular day and age were. So let's take a look at the introduction to Jonathan Swift in our textbook. If you haven't read that yet, please go ahead and read that. It's on page 439. It continues on page 440, and there are a couple of paragraphs on 440 I want to bring to your attention. At the bottom of the first column on 440, on the focus on Lilliput. In A Voyage to Lilliput, Swift created the Lilliputians, who are only 6 inches tall. He uses the tiny Lilliputians to reduce the importance of people in general, and politicians in particular. Focusing on disputes between the Church of England and Roman Catholicism, he called the followers of each Little Indians and Big Indians, respectively. In this section of the novel, Swift also satirizes the religious wars between Protestant England and Catholic France, disguising them as a conflict between Lilliput and its neighbor island, Blefuscu. On one level, Gulliver's Travels is a travel book, filled with thrilling and exotic adventures. On the other level, however, the novel satirizes how people can be narrow-minded and even cruel. Swift reserved special venom for politicians who belong to the Whig Party, and you have a paragraph explaining why he was so against the Whigs. But as we take a look on page 441, we have this introduction. Gulliver finds himself there in Lilliput. He is huge compared to these people, so he has to be careful not to step on them or allow his coat that he's wearing to swish against their houses and tear up their houses. If you have not read your selection of Gulliver's Travels, you need to do that first. You can also play the online edition. You see up here, you can play that. It's a 14-minute, 15-second video or recording, so it's not very long. But you can do that yourself and then come back and watch the rest of the video. All right, so I'm supposing that you've read Gulliver's Travels now. And on page 442, there are some things here I'd like to point out especially. Our annotate and close read instructions at the top say mark a couple of details in paragraph 1 that describe how Gulliver walks through the town. How does he walk? What pictures do these details create in the reader's mind? How do you visualize these details? How do these details help you visualize Melindo, the capital city, Meldindo rather, and Gulliver? At the very top of 442 we read, I stepped over the great western gate and passed very gently and sidling through the two principal streets, only in my short waistcoat, for fear of damaging the roofs and eaves of the houses with the skirts of my coat. I walked with the utmost circumspection to avoid treading on any stragglers who might remain in the streets, although the orders were very strict that all people should keep in their houses at their own peril. So they made sure that whenever Gulliver was going to walk in the streets, everybody had to stay in their houses so he wouldn't step on them. So as I read paragraph 1, I notice and I highlight the details that describe how Gulliver walks into the town, making sure he only has his vest on, his waistcoat or waistcoat, as sometimes it's called. Doesn't use his big long overcoat because he's afraid if he swishes back and forth he would hurt their roofs. And then the question, how does he walk? What picture do these details create in the reader's mind? Well, because he's so big, he walks carefully so he won't harm the buildings or people. So I can imagine this giant of a man tiptoeing over houses and any stray person who happened to be left in the street. And then, how do these details help you visualize Meldindo and Gulliver? Well, I can see the height difference between Gulliver and the Lilliputians and a frightened look on his face for fear of hurting somebody, because he is a doctor. He wants to make sure he doesn't hurt anybody. And the wonder in his eyes of the Lilliputians who watch him go by. They've never seen such a giant as Gulliver is. Then on page 443, we have the section after all the description about how big he is compared to how small they are, with the beginning of the satire of this story. If you look around the middle of 443, as he's talking to one of these friends that he's made about their society, he began with compliments on my liberty and said he might pretend to some merit in it. But however, he added, that if I had not been for the present situation of things at court, perhaps I might not have obtained it so soon. For he said, as flourishing a condition as we may appear to be in foreigners, we labor under two mighty evils, a violent faction at home, and the danger of an invasion by a most potent enemy from abroad. As to the first, you are to understand that for about 70 moons past, there have been two struggling parties in the empire, under the names of Tramuscan and Slamuscan, from the high and low heels of their shoes, by which they distinguish themselves. It is alleged indeed that the high heels are most agreeable to our ancient constitution. In other words, the high heels, the fancy folks are the conservatives. But however this may be, His Majesty has determined to make use only of low heels in the administration of the government and of all offices in the gift of the crown. As you cannot but observe, and particularly His Majesty's imperial heels are lower at least by a drur than any of his court. A drur is to measure about the 14th part of an inch. The animosities between these two parties run so high that they will neither eat, nor drink, nor talk with each other. We might say this could apply even in our time today. Here we have two groups of people. We might say the Democrats and the Republicans. They would say the high heels and the low heels. To Gulliver, they're all so tiny anyway, it doesn't make any difference. And Gulliver really doesn't see the reason behind the split. If these two would get together and do something good for the kingdom, that would be good. So we might say the same thing about modern politics too. From an outsider, the differences in one party versus another party may not seem even that great. And so Jonathan Swift, as a minister, is trying to bring people together and trying to say, overlook some of the smaller differences to help the country, for the good of the country. So this is how he puts it in his terms as he's making up a story to symbolize what's really going on in his country. We compute the Tramuscan or high heels to exceed us in number, but the power is wholly on our side. We apprehend His Imperial Highness and heir to the crown to have some tendency toward the high heels. At least we can plainly discover that one of his heels is higher than the other, which gives him a hobble in his gait. So even the king himself is a hybrid of the two groups. One of his heels is a little higher than the other heel. Now he turns to religion and to the Protestant versus Catholic mentality. Now, Jonathan Swift was a minister in the Church of England, but he often did not like how the Church of England treated the Irish Catholics. He was actually brought up in Ireland, and had a great affinity for the Irish people, and often stuck up for them, even against his own English people. So he puts it this way. Now, in the midst of these internecine quarrels, we are threatened with an invasion from the island of Blefuscu, which could represent France as well, which is the other great empire of the universe, almost as large and powerful as this of His Majesty. Now, he has to make the differences in their religion sound silly, and so he does by saying they worship the egg. And the king had a grandfather who, when that man was a little boy, had broken his hard-boiled egg for breakfast at the opposite end of what tradition stated. And so his father, and cut his finger, by the way, doing it. So his father decreed that the other end of the egg would be appropriate for their worship, their religion, and that everybody's supposed to, come together and do things the same way. Well, some people said, no, you're going against tradition, and it split their country. So rather than allowing, I think the little boy, when he had the egg, broke the egg at the traditional ends, what it was, and cut his finger. And so then his father said, no, we're going to flip the egg over and we're going to break the egg at the other end. That's not traditional. So some people said that they were making a division in religion and they split from them. Now to Gulliver, that sounds silly. He said he had read their holy book, and by the way, it said to cut an egg at the more convenient end. So both groups were wrong. But neither one of them listened to what their holy book actually said and decided to do things their own traditional way. So that's Swift's way of saying both groups might have gotten it wrong. Maybe we need to come together. Maybe we need to realize what the holy book actually does say. And so he's really making a swipe at religion right there. And so that caused holy wars in their country for years and years and years. And so Gulliver decides that, well, that sounds silly to me, but, I want to respect these people, so I'll try to go along with their traditions. But after the excerpt in our book, we find out what really happens. The king of Lilliput wants Gulliver to go over to Blefuscu and kill them all. Wipe them out, step on them, crush them. And of course, Gulliver's not going to do that. He instead does go over. He grabs all their ships. He brings all the Blefuscuan ships over to the land of Lilliput so the war will stop. But the king is still not happy. He wanted Gulliver to destroy his enemy. And so plans are then made to poison Gulliver because he wouldn't be as mean as they are. He has a few friends there. They warn Gulliver what's going to happen. He likes these people. He's really grown fond of many of them, but he decides he will go ahead and leave them. And when he does, he ends up in another land, in Alaska, at the land of the Brobdingnagians, the giants, where he has a number of adventures there too. So in all of these stories, we can read it on a fun story level, or we can read Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels on the level that he really intended, as a satire, making fun of politics, making fun of religion, but for the purpose of trying to improve the society, not just to make fun of religion, because he was a minister himself, but to bring people together who seemed to be divided over little petty matters that really didn't matter at all. And as you read more of that Gulliver's Travels excerpt, you may be able to pick out some other things that Swift talks about and relate those to things he may be satirizing. One aspect not included in our book has to do with how people get their government jobs in Lilliput. They walk on a tight wire in front of the king and turn somersaults on the tight wire. And the people who can do the most tricks get the highest government jobs. So again, that's another way of Swift saying, people in government aren't really qualified. It's who you know. It's who you please. It's who applauds you the most. That's pretty heavy for back in those days. In a time that was politically charged, when you could even get put in prison if you made fun of the existing government. But Swift believed it was his duty as a citizen to point out the negatives of society for the purpose of trying to improve his society.